Where do I even start with the Dreamcast? How would you begin to discuss this little ill-fated 6th-gen console? Most people who have never even played or heard of a Sega Dreamcast will wonder, what's all the hype about? What is so great about this unsuspecting little box that tons of people on the internet have covered it? What made it so influential for the time that every Sega fan on the planet loves the thing? That's what I'm going to talk about today. In this new documentary style that I'm sort of trying out with this console, considering I have a lot of knowledge about it, and I wanted to do some research about it anyway, I'm going to talk about this console. But first, a little background. In 1988, Sega, a Japanese software developer originally manufacturing slot machines and whatnot up until the 1970s, released the Mega Drive, known in North America as the Genesis. The system boasted a 16-bit processor and quote-unquote high-definition graphics, despite still running on the most popular at the time AV and RF formats at 480p. The console was pretty much ignored outside of Europe, and Nintendo's Famicom or NES system was still pretty much dominating the market across North America and Japan. The console simply had no appeal, and wasn't cheap enough at the time to attract large audiences, until the release of a little game that you may have heard of called Sonic the Hedgehog. With the release of Nintendo's Super Nintendo in 1990, the console needed a way to compete with the growing popularity of Super Mario World, the fourth game in the Super Mario Bros. Series, a pretty popular series up to that point and one of the first 2D platformers. Up to that point, Sega had only ever had a singular mascot, Alex Kidd, who lacked the signature and unique style of Mario. Mario was seen by Sega as uncool and dated, and so they tried their best with their ridiculously fast CPU in comparison to the SNES to make the fastest, boastful, snotty character they could come up with. The first game of the series was released in 1991 and it was a huge success, topping even NBA Jam and Mortal Kombat, also hosted on the system. In fact, part of the reason why the game ended up being the best-selling game on the Genesis was because of Sega deciding to halve the price of the console and bundle Sonic the Hedgehog with it. The aggressive marketing for the system coupled with the low price made it an instant classic and Sega's best-selling console, though the SNES outsold it by 19 million units. By 1994, however, the company had 2 add-ons for the console, one of which was only out for a year in North America due to it only being put out to satisfy demands until the Sega Saturn, Sega's next major console. The throw it at a wall and see if it sticks tactic was slowly killing the company. Meanwhile, Sony was attempting to collaborate with Nintendo for a CD-ROM add-on for the Super Nintendo similar to that of the Sega CD, one of the previously mentioned add-ons for the Genesis. Nintendo silently backed out of the deal to work with Philips, a deal that resulted in Nintendo licensing the rights to Super Mario and The Legend of Zelda to the Philips CDI. Needless to say, Nintendo refuses to acknowledge the games even exist. Sony decided it would be better to work on their own, which birthed the PlayStation. At the first ever E3 game convention, Sega announced the Saturn at $399 and released it months early, telling the crowd it was available immediately. Sony, about ready to announce their PlayStation console, had a large speech prepared to deliver for the whole of the convention. Instead, the Sony representative went on stage after Sega and uttered one word.
I'm going to ask Sony Computer Entertainment President of America, Steve Reyes, to join me for a brief presentation. $299.
Ouch. Sega's Saturn system had no official Sonic games released for it, other than Sonic R, a poorly received racing game, Sonic 3D Blast, a port of a poorly received Genesis game, starting to see a pattern here, and Sonic Jam, which was a collection of the past Genesis Sonic games, Sonic 1, Sonic 2, Sonic 3, and Sonic & Knuckles. The Saturn bombed, selling less than a tenth of the PlayStation, and a little over the third of the Nintendo 64. Due to the lack of good exclusive games for the console, it struggled to last on the market even 3 years. And now, we come to the Dreamcast. Japan, December 1998. The launch of Sega's final console, the swan song from the company that once brought us Sonic the Hedgehog, Columns, Vector Man, and even Altered Beast was finally going under. But Sega had one last spark of brilliance, which is probably the reason why you clicked on this video. In 1998, around the launch of the Dreamcast, came probably the one thing that saved the company from completely going under: Sonic Adventure. This was the first original Sonic game that we had gotten in the US since 1994. And yeah, I mean, this game isn't necessarily the peak of gaming or anything. The cutscenes and camera have certainly not aged well at all, but it was what Sega needed to continue making games, albeit sometimes garbage ones. It was one of only 2 official non-spin-off games to be released for the Dreamcast in the Sonic the Hedgehog series that had brought them fame almost 10 years ago at that point. The console could be played online with 27 games in its heyday until 2003 when servers were shut down for the console. The system had a modem built in, the first console to ever do so. The console's memory cards, called virtual memory units, or VMUs, featured a screen on them that you could use to navigate your save files or take a more Tamagotchi route with Sonic Adventure 2 and Sonic Adventure 1. Yes, I said those out of order. And those 2 games actually featured a mini VMU game called Chao Adventure that allowed you to play with virtual pets called Chao that you received in the Dreamcast game. The console, which supported online, allowed you to download DLC for your Dreamcast games. Sonic Adventure 2 had seasonal Halloween and Christmas costumes, and Sonic Adventure had Christmas DLC, Y2K DLC to celebrate the release of Samba de Amigo, and various others. I bet you're thinking that it wasn't much, but for 90s standards, it was plenty for most fans of the console, and they didn't have to wait long for a full online multiplayer experience. Choo Choo Rocket, of course. This little simple game was one of the first online multiplayer games for a console ever. You could connect the Dreamcast modem and get online easily, at least then, and some games can still be played online with the Dreamcast to this day. But the first real online experience for most of the people who are going to be talking about this console is Phantasy Star Online. People played this game for hours on end and made a lot of friends doing it. Unlike World of Warcraft and games like that, it was hands-on combat. It didn't have that weird overhead perspectives like most RPGs, and it was an early MMO game for a console. It's one of the only 5 games for the Dreamcast that can still be played online to this day. The game was even ported to the GameCube and Xbox. But it wasn't all wine and roses for the Dreamcast. Sony was still a huge competitor for Sega, and the launch of their PS2 overshadowed the Dreamcast by a lot. The market just didn't trust Sega enough. They had become a laughingstock, and the market had good reason not to trust them. The Saturn was extremely overhyped by Sega and way too expensive. The add-ons for the Genesis were overpriced and were not supported for long and extremely expensive, and also nobody liked them. The Dreamcast also had extremely scarce marketing post-launch, which led to the console's failure. With the rush of the PS2 and the release of the Xbox later, people quickly forgot about the Dreamcast and what it had achieved for future consoles. A problem was also beginning to persist in mid-2000, and that was burned discs. The console's only anti-piracy method was the format it used, CD-ROMs. They stood for Gigabyte Disc ROMs, and they were exactly what they sounded like. CD-ROMs that contained a gigabyte of data as opposed to the most common 700 megabytes of data. It seemed like a viable logical method to keep people from pirating software. If developers had a gigabyte of data to use, they would most likely use it, right? But this had an obvious loophole. If developers didn't use this whole gigabyte of data, or if the files were compressed, these games could be easily ripped and burned. Because of market distrust and this piracy issue, the console didn't stay afloat. On January 31st, 2001, the Dreamcast was discontinued. Now, before you think this was the end for Sega's white box, software for the Raspberry Pi called DreamPi is designed to be able to get the Dreamcast online easily, and no, I'm not sponsored by them, I just think it's really cool and I figured I'd mention it. The piracy problems that I mentioned earlier in this video that killed the console, in a way, have also kept it alive. As recent as 2018, unofficial games have been released for the console by fans. Due to the failure of the Dreamcast, Sega decided to port Sonic Adventure and Sonic Adventure 2, 1998 and 2001 respectively, to Nintendo's console, the GameCube? Despite being pretty common now for a Sonic game to be released on a Nintendo console, it was unheard of and seen as weird. But a lot of people had those games as their introduction to the Sonic the Hedgehog series, and the 2 games are often considered the best in the whole franchise. The games have been ported to Xbox 360, Steam, and various other systems. In fact, even now, people still are pushing out homebrew for this console. Crafti is a popular Minecraft clone that has been ported to the original Xbox, N64, and Dreamcast. Sega has still stayed alive solely as a game developer. Their most recently announced title is a new Sonic game for PS4, PS5, and various other recent systems called Sonic Frontiers. Not a lot of info is out on the game other than a trailer and a scratch release date. But the game seems to follow sort of in the footsteps of Sonic Adventure in my eyes, whereas it has an open world, but also it's definitely a Sonic game, not just another Breath of the Wild clone by another franchise. It's a little sad to realize that Sega would have been better off as a software developer in the first place, but without them making consoles, we wouldn't have a lot of what we had today. Online multiplayer, DLC, all that stuff was pretty much done first on a mass scale by Sega.